Hello guys, welcome to another Path of Exile 2 video actually, because that Path of Exile 2 early access is rapidly approaching. That 15th of November date is coming up quickly, and Path of Exile 2 has kind of been traveling around the world, going to different conventions to show off the game. The developers have been attending those conventions and, they've been showing off what they've been working on. And the most recent of those conventions was the Tokyo Game Show, which happened in just the last few days. And before that convention actually started, they had a few days of press getting their hands on the game and doing interviews and things like that. And from one of those presser events with the interview there, we got some information about some keystones in Path of Exile 2. And there's some returning keystones that have changed quite significantly, and there's some completely new keystones. And I want to give a shout out here to Talkative Try, who made a video on these keystones just a few days back. So this video is going to be talking about some of those keystones, talking about their implications on the game. And what I've done is I've kind of taken some of those keystones there and I've converted them into, how a keystone would look in the game, because these were keystones, they were taken from screenshots which were then translated into English, and the translations weren't exactly correct in terms of how modifiers would read and how they would be understood in the game. So I've kind of translated them to look like a normal keystone in the game, and we're going to be talking about a few of those in this video. I won't be talking about all of them in this video because there's quite a lot to get through, so I'll probably be making another video or two on these in the coming weeks. Yeah, so this video is going to be about those keystones, and let's get into it. We're starting with Eternal Youth. Now, Eternal Youth in Path of Exile 1 is a way to apply Energy Shield Recharge to life instead of Energy Shield. And Energy Shield Recharge is a way to recover Energy Shield, but unlike regeneration, it has very specific mechanics for how it works. You need to have a period of 2 seconds where you don't take any damage to Energy Shield for Energy Shield Recharge to actually begin, and once it begins, it recharges at a rate of 33% per second, and gets interrupted if you take damage to Energy Shield. Now in Path of Exile 1, Eternal Youth applies Energy Shield Recharge to life instead, but it does so at the cost of a 50% less life regeneration and 50% less maximum life leech. So it significantly reduces the efficacy of those two recovery mechanics, and makes it so that you pretty much only want to focus on life recharge as your main source of recovering life. But in Path of Exile 2, it looks like Eternal Youth is changing quite a bit. The Energy Shield Recharge applying to life is still going to be there, but the downsides of losing half of your life regeneration and half of your maximum leech are gone. The new downside, which can be considered as an upside at the same time as well, is now that life recovery from flasks applies to Energy Shield instead of life. Now, this is where things get really interesting, because as I mentioned before, Energy Shield Recharge has a special way of interacting with how it actually recovers the resource that it's protecting. When it's converted to be Life Recharge, all of the mechanics from Energy Shield Recharge apply to life instead, which means that damage must be dealt to life to prevent that recharge from kicking in. So if you have a character that has, a bunch of life and a bunch of Energy Shield, if you take this keystone, you can then always use your life flask to recover Energy Shield, and anytime you kind of take a big hit where it removes your Energy Shield and your life, you can then immediately use your life flask to recover the Energy Shield, and any new instances of damage that are coming in are going to be interacting with Energy Shield first, which buys time for that life recharge to kick in, and hopefully get you topped off to full. Obviously there is still chaos damage, and there's things that you can do to, prevent chaos damage from bypassing Energy Shield, but this is a really interesting mechanic that's coming into Path of Exile 2. And I think one of the things that's really interesting that we're going to see in a continuation of themes here with the Path of Exile 2 keystones is big changes that are coming in Path of Exile 2 to flasks specifically, because flasks are going to be very, very different in Path of Exile 2 compared to Path of Exile 1. In Path of Exile 1, we're kind of used to these really crazy flasks. Things like Coruscating Elixir come to mind, things like Progenesis. These are build-defining flask options, and flasks in general in Path of Exile 1 are very powerful, is a good term to describe them. They are extremely powerful. A bunch of a character's power is kind of locked into flasks, and there's no real way of kind of getting out of it. You know, if you're not using Flask in Path of Exile 1, you're losing a huge part of character power. And it looks like in Path of Exile 2, a lot of the power from Flasks is being moved away from Flasks, and Flasks will almost entirely be used just for recovery mechanics and some very specific ways to remove ailments and things like that. We have heard in the past when GGG have been talking about Flasks, they've kind of referred to Flasks as a replacement for guard skills. We don't really know exactly how that's going to work or whether that's still the intention, but I think for the most part we're going to see Flask interactions which are specific to recovering resources and removing basic ailments. We already see in that kind of teaser image on the Path of Exile 2 website a character using 2 life flasks, 2 mana flasks, and an antidote flask, which is simply removing poison. That's all it does. So I think the idea of having a lot of interactions with, you know, changing which recovery applies to which resource and things like that is very interesting, and Path of Exile 2 overall is going to make very, very big changes to Flasks. And speaking of Flasks, here's another keystone which interacts directly with Flasks. It's called Oasis. This is a brand new keystone. This doesn't exist in Path of Exile 1. And Oasis is going to remove 2 of your 5 Flask slots, and it's going to provide 50% more recovery from Flasks. So the direct translation that came for this keystone was 50% more healing from Flasks, and I think that's basically going to be 50% more recovery. So this will interact with life recovery from Flasks, it will also interact with mana recovery, and, as we've just seen there on the Eternal Youth keystone, which converts life recovery to energy shield recovery instead, that will interact with this keystone. You'll be able to take both of these together and you now get 50% more recovery for your energy shield from your life flasks, which is really, really cool. So this is a great interaction here that's going on, and I think Oasis is a really cool keystone and another example of how they're going about changing Flasks in Path of Exile 2. The idea of losing 2 of your Flask slots in Path of Exile 1 is kind of ridiculous, especially in trade-off for 50% more recovery. That just sounds like a terrible decision to make, because Flasks are so strong, especially utility Flasks in Path of Exile 1 are so unbelievably powerful. And in Path of Exile 2, as I mentioned before, that's just not going to be the case. It's going to be a lot of recovery coming in from your Flasks. You're going to be using your Flasks when you get damaged on a lot of builds, because we already know that a lot of recovery that we kind of take for granted in Path of Exile 1, like stacking lots of regeneration and leech, isn't going to be quite as powerful in Path of Exile 2. So you're going to be relying on your Flasks a bit more for recovering life and other resources. So the idea of trading off 2 of your Flask slots for getting a bit more recovery from those Flasks does actually make sense in that context. And now we're moving on to another keystone, which is not a keystone in Path of Exile 1, but notable on the passive skill tree. That's Whispers of Doom. Now in Path of Exile 2, this is going to be a keystone, and it's going to do the same kind of upside there. You can apply an additional curse, but the downside of this keystone is that the cast time for curse skills is doubled. Now, the actual translation of this was curse activation runtime is doubled, but I think that pretty much translates into cast time being doubled. And we're not sure exactly how this is going to work with automation. We know that there's going to be a lot of automation in Path of Exile 2. There's going to be a lot of ways that you can automate things, but I think the likelihood of having these automation things not having a downside of something that interacts with cast time is extremely unlikely. So the idea of having this keystone here that doubles curse cast time means that anytime you're trying to automate it, you're probably going to have a longer cooldown on it or something like that, because it's going to be based on the cast time, which may still be beneficial, because the doubling of curse cast time sounds kind of bad in the context of PoE1. You can imagine how long you're going to be standing there casting your curse skill, especially if you have several of them to use, because this, of course, grants you an extra curse as well. But that's an interesting change, and I think Whispers of Doom becoming a keystone is quite cool. It's one of those iconic notables in Path of Exile 1 that so many builds take because of how powerful it is. So that's an interesting change there. And the final keystone we're going to be talking about in this video is a completely crazy one, Giant's Blood. So this keystone is something we don't have in Path of Exile 1, and I think we don't have it for a good reason, because it's completely ridiculous. So, Giant's Blood, you can wield a 2-handed melee weapon in one hand. weapon requirements are doubled. So, wielding a two-handed melee weapon in one hand just sounds ridiculous. What this means in terms of being able to dual wield two-handed melee weapons at the same time, or being able to use a two-handed melee weapon and a shield, and what implications that's going to have on, what abilities you can use with it, things like that. Nobody knows for sure. But I think one thing that I really want to focus on here is the weapon requirements are doubled, because that's actually a really interesting topic here. What exactly does that mean? Now, I think most people are going to look at that and they're going to, take a look at the stats that are required for a weapon and decide that this is going to be worth it or not, whether you have to invest in so many stats. We don't know how many stats a two-handed weapon at the top end are going to require in Path of Exile 2. They may require a lot more than they do in Path of Exile 1. An example of a two-handed axe in Path of Exile 1 is the Flesh Ripper. This is the kind of top level base. It requires 156 strength and 84 dexterity, so you can imagine doubling that, and that's what you're going to need to wield this in a one-handed weapon slot. But I think that the weapon requirements also includes the level requirement. Now, this two-handed Flesh Ripper requires a level 70 character, so if you wanted to equip this in a one-handed weapon, you would need a level 140 character, which of course doesn't exist. So I think what happens here is that this keystone is kind of going to be gated by what weapons you can actually use. So here's an example. This axe right here, this is another two-handed axe, which is significantly weaker. It's a lot lower down there in the chain of kind of ascending weapon tiers. And this requires level 49. It also requires a lot less attributes there as well. If this is doubled, you would be able to achieve that on a level 98 character. And I think that that's exactly what this means. I think it's actually referring to all of the requirements, not just the stats. So even though you're going to be able to wield, a two-handed weapon in a one-handed slot, which is still going to be very powerful, it's not quite as powerful as it initially seems, if it is in fact gated by level requirements as well. Of course, it's possible that there are things in the game like unique items and things like that you can use to lower the level requirement on specific things. And you might be able to find a unique amulet, for example, that lowers some requirements of weapons. Maybe it's specialized to be used with this keystone, which will then allow you to use more powerful two-handed weapons with this keystone. But I think the idea of this keystone, having it balanced in a way that is actually healthy for the game, it kind of makes sense if you can't use two of the top two-handed bases on each hand, because that just seems completely ridiculous. But that is a wild keystone, and there's a lot more of these crazy keystones I'm going to be covering in follow-up videos on this topic. So stick around for those, but that's going to be it for this one, guys. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.